Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Thomas Vague, and I am the Community Engagement Manager for our AAAS-IUSE Initiative here at the American Association for the Advancement of Science. We are excited for today's workshop, Promoting Equity in Undergraduate STEM Classrooms through Pedagogical Approaches, featuring Dr. Roni Ellington and Dr. Chandralekha Singh. Before we dive in, I have a few housekeeping notes. This presentation is being recorded and live streamed. The recording and slides will be made available on our AAAS-IUSE website, and you'll each receive an email when these materials are available. Following Dr. Ellington and Dr. Singh's presentations, we encourage everyone to join our speakers and facilitators in breakout rooms to further discuss today's content and learn from each other. There will be plenty of time to pose your questions in the breakout rooms, so we ask you to please save any questions until then. Breakout rooms will not be recorded and they will not be live streamed. Additionally, we have closed captioning available for this workshop. You can download and view the full transcript by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your screen. As always, we hope you will continue to engage with us through the AAAS-IUSE Initiative as we work to support faculty, students, and the greater undergraduate STEM education community by disseminating research and knowledge about STEM teaching, learning, equity, and institutional transformation. We have a few exciting work products coming up in the pipeline here. First, our initiative has a video featured at the STEM for All showcase. It shares strategies from 3 IUSE community members for leveraging this moment of disruption to develop strategies that make classrooms more inclusive and for addressing the inequities faced during this pandemic by students traditionally underrepresented in STEM. This video and our accompanied lessons learned resource, which features more information on these crowdsourced strategies, can be found via the links that my colleagues are dropping in the chat now. Also, if you have an IUSE award, you should have received an invitation to June's event series titled the AAAS-IUSE Summer Labs, Catalyzing Inclusive, Transformative Undergraduate Education. If you haven't received your invitation, send us an email at iuse@AAAS.org. And now, without further ado, I would like to turn it over to our first speaker, Dr. Ellington.
Welcome, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. So what I'm here to talk to you about is moving equity and inclusion from the margins to the center of the work that we do, and specifically looking at principles of culture responsive teaching as a means to do that. First, I want to say I'm humbled and I'm grateful to have this opportunity to speak with you. Anytime I am blessed with an opportunity to speak with people, I take it very, very seriously because I know you're listening and your time is very valuable. So it is my pleasure to be here with you, specifically with AAAS. I'm just humbled. That's all. It's my pleasure. I hope and pray that what I bring to you will not only have you think about your pedagogical practice differently, but also think about who you are differently. Because I believe that to improve undergraduate STEM education, we need to kind of improve the way we think about the work we do and who we are as it relates to the work we do. So I want to say just thank you. I'm really honored to be here. And I also invite you to listen to this presentation with your head and your heart. I know we as STEM folks, generally, we try to figure things out. We want to have the answer before the question actually is even clear. But I would argue that many of the answers that you're seeking are within you. You just need some room to really think them through and be with them in a particular way. So I invite you to listen with your head and your heart to this presentation. So I've just brought up some statistics. I cannot do a STEM presentation without a few statistics. So I put in my infographics to give you a sense of some of the state of affairs in STEM education. So the first infographic is representing out of 100 students who enter college to obtain a bachelor's degree. And that's when you talk about Black, white, disabled, all kinds of groups disaggregated. For every 100 students who enter college, only 19 of them graduate with bachelor's in STEM majors. I just want us to sit with that. Out of 100, 19. And then STEM bachelors working in STEM after college goes to about 10. And then when you talk about after 10 years, you have about 8. So you notice that there's a lot of attrition as we think about who comes into college and then who's actually working in STEM after 10 years. Now, when you think about that and aggregate it for gender, of 100 women who enter colleges, 12 of them will declare majors in STEM. 5 will continue to work in STEM after 2 years and only 3 after 10. Now, when you think about the intersection of African-American women, or you think about African-Americans or Hispanics in general, we could not even create an infographic to represent the data. We probably have like a foot, a toe, a half a person, right? It wouldn't even, the numbers are so low that these infographics cannot be created. So when we think about STEM broadly, there is this attrition. But when you think about it specifically, it's even more egregious. Next slide. Hold on. Okay, so then when we think about African Americans, there's a negative yield of African Americans who persist in the pipeline. And this is, again, not to go into this infographic, but when you think about of the number of high school graduates from 2005 and you watch the leak, when you think about STEM graduates in 2011, it's about 166,530, and this was from 2005 to 2011. And for African Americans entering this pipeline, there's a negative yield, meaning it's likely that they will be turned away in numbers greater than we can even count. So this has been a problem, and this problem has existed as long as I can remember. And I know that, excuse me, the crisis, if we continue in this way, what will our STEM table look like in the next 10 to 50 years? If we continue this leak, when you think of the STEM pipeline broadly, and specifically when you think about minority students and women, we cannot sustain this level of leakage, okay? And if we don't address it, we'll have some table that looks like this. We'll be talking to no one. And here's the question that I just want to impose. I want to just pose, not impose, but I want to pose to the group here. And I call this the 911 in STEM education. After years of well-intentioned efforts focused on diversity, inclusion, social justice, feminism, special education, we can go on and on, we see very little movement in our equity and inclusion related outcomes. Why has such smart, evidence-driven folks allowed these results to be okay? That's a question I just want us to kind of bring to the backdrop of this discussion. Why has this been okay? I shared with some people earlier in another meeting I was in that in 9/11, when we had that crisis, we changed air travel in roughly 6 months. Yet for the last 50 years, we've been having this discussion about STEM education, diversity, inclusion, equity, whatever you want to call it, and we have not been able to crack the nut. So I want you to just dwell on why is that not only happening, and why is it okay? Next slide. Okay, why is that? Well, let me give you a little bit of my backstory so I can position myself to answer that question. Why has it gone this way? First of all, as you can see, I'm an African-American woman. I grew up in DC. At the time when I grew up in DC, it was predominantly Black. It has shifted a little bit over the last 40 years. And when I was in elementary school, I was told that I had a special need or I had some kind of special issue or something. I don't even remember what the diagnosis was. So when I went into junior high school, I was placed in what you call low track classes. I was in like 7-6. It was like, 7-1 was the bright ones and 7-2 and then on until 7-7. And I was in 7-6. So you can imagine that given that that's where I was placed, the question is, how did you end up here? Because normally when students are tracked in those ways, they are not in what I consider these kind of positions having accomplished what I have. And I reflected on my story as I went into my work. So I'm a fast forward. I went on to, I got out of those low track courses because a teacher saw that I was misplaced. Actually, it ended up being a white male geography teacher who was like, she shouldn't be here. So I went on to go to high school. I graduated valedictorian of my high school, went on to Morgan State University, went on to get a master's degree, an undergraduate degree in mathematics, and a PhD in math education. And I share this with you because throughout this trajectory of my experience, things could have gone many different ways in my trajectory. And I would assert that I was the same person that was designated as special or problematic as I am today. The who I am has never shifted, but the lens through which people saw me and my own brilliance shifted, which gave me opportunities that I did not have. It wasn't this fixed, what do you call it? This fixed achievement or this fixed ability that was me. It wasn't that. It was how people saw me and worked with me that shifted and changed the game for me. And particularly when I went to Morgan and majored in mathematics. For those who don't know, Morgan State University is an HBCU. The institution I currently work in is the institution I went to. When I was at Morgan, the perception was whoever was in these classes belonged here. And I didn't necessarily have the best education. I did graduate top of my class, but I went to Spingarn at a time where it was a neighborhood, local high school. There was no special programs. In fact, my father advocated for me to take calculus when the class wasn't offered. And I really didn't get real calculus, y'all. It was like calculus concepts. So it wasn't that I had this stellar education, nor was it that I was this special human being. But I will tell you that the ways in which people saw me began to shift, which opened opportunities that if that vision wasn't there for me, I would not be here. I'm very clear about that. Nothing innately changed about who I was, okay? So that kind of, people ask me, am I special? When I tell them about my special, and I'm like, no, I'm actually the most unspecial person you'd ever find. But what I could tell you is that people saw me differently, and then I had a certain kind of education that changed the game. So what that did was it started to have me think about, well, I was not special. I took that out, and I started to think about what do I want my research trajectory to be about? When I went into graduate school, I started to think about what did I want to study? And one of the things I wanted to study was the experiences of high achieving students in mathematics. My dissertation research was about looking at the experiences of high achieving African-American students in mathematics and stop looking at these like deficit narratives. So, because I was clear as a graduate student, and I still am clear, that in order to understand success, you have to study success. Just studying deficiency does not necessarily produce success. And then it started to help me look at social cultural factors that impacted student success. I started to think about interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary learning experiences, the roles of parents, and so on. So all of my research from this point comes from who I am as a person, my experiences. I do not devoid my work as a mathematician and a math educator from who I am as a person. It drives everything that I do. So I set this context because what I'm about to share with you really is shaped from my experience and what I know to be true and my own scholarship. So the first thing I want to do is be very transparent about the way we should frame this discussion around equity, inclusion, diversity, whatever you want to call it, is this, we need to reframe this work around from this us versus them, right versus wrong, getting it right, making sure we're doing the right thing. I know that's provocative, because what I would argue is that in order for us to engage in this equity work, we have to be authentic about just how messy it is to be a human being, right? I'm not going to give you a list of strategies that you can just go do and do them right and do them well, and then it's all going to turn around. I would be lying to you if I said that. What I have learned from not only my personal experience, but my own research is that being human is messy. It is messy and it's terrifying sometimes, because to step out on the skinny branches and to start thinking about your instruction in new ways can be very shattering, terrifying, scary, all of those words. But I promise you that no one died of discomfort. You can make it through the messiness of shifting the way you think about your work. Right? It might be just uncomfortable. You may try a strategy and it may not go as well as you may think, but I promise you, if you continue in the process, who you are will shift. And the way you think about your work will shift. And that to me is more important than getting it right on the first go. Okay? I just want to put that out there. So I'm not going to go into this broader framework, but I have to kind of present it because this is the work that I ground all of my talks in. I was a part of a book effort called Looking at STEM Education from a Racial Perspective. And this framework is a framework that started in my dissertation work. When I told you I looked at the experiences of high achieving students, they actually started the genesis of this framework that I discuss all over the country, this whole idea of a framework to think about STEM education from. And it has 4 components. There's this idea of thinking about student identity, agency, and resiliency. So any framework that's going to shift STEM education has to have these 4 components. You have to consider who the students are, their agency, and how they belong. You have to think about teacher professional development, instructional professional development from a lens of empowerment, and really shifting teachers' perspectives of themselves from content experts to agents of change. And I talk about that in whole detail about how you have to think about professional development. And then utilizing and contributing to community, social, and political capital. We need to start thinking about our STEM education inside of the capitals of the communities we serve. And then there's the transformative pedagogical practices. For today's work, I'm talking specifically about culturally responsive teaching as a transformative pedagogical practice. So I'm being very transparent that I'm only speaking about this component of a bigger framework, okay? Because there are many different pieces you have to think about, but culturally responsive teaching can actually be a transformative framework that changes what you teach and how you teach. And the message that is sent when you think about instruction from this lens is STEM education is critical, vital, and relevant to each of us, our communities, solving real problems and understanding the world around us. This is the message that must be sent throughout our pedagogical practice if it's going to be culturally responsive. So again, not to give you a whole bunch of alphabet soup and word soup, here's a definition of culturally responsive teaching that has been used a lot by Dr. Gay. When you talk about culturally, we're talking about the social values, the cognitive codes, behavioral standards, and worldviews of those we serve, including ourselves. When you talk about being responsive, saying or doing something as a response to something or someone in a positive way, you think about teaching, it is the process to attending to people's needs, experiences, and feelings. So taking together, when we think about culturally responsive teaching, it is relational and content driven. So it's not only the what in the teaching, it's the how and how we respond. How is our STEM teaching responding to the needs of those in our space? Notice it's not just content, because it can be done through content, but it's broader than that. It's about relating to social values. It's about responding, and it's about teaching, which is attending to someone else's needs. And that's going to be important when we think about culturally responsive teaching. So an educator who's culturally responsive can recognize students' cultural displays of learning, respond positively and constructively with teaching moves that use cultural knowledge as a way to scaffold content from what students know to the new concepts we are trying to promote. So think of these words. So one, if you're culturally responsive, you gotta recognize students. It brings me to a statement I tell my math faculty all the time. We don't teach math, we teach students mathematics. So the recognition of the student is critical in culturally responsive teaching. And then responding positively. It doesn't mean we sugarcoat what needs to be said, but there's always a positive narrative we can bring to any student's experience, even if it's not the achievement outcomes we're looking for. There's always something to respond positively to and constructively to in our teacher moves. And we use the cultural knowledge of ourselves and our students to connect and promote information processing. So this is the place you need to come from if you're going to have a chance of being culturally responsive. So notice, recognize students' culture, respond positively and constructively, use culture funds of knowledge to incorporate and connect, scaffold, connect, promote. These are kind of the teacher moves that are a part of culturally responsive teaching. And it's not a one-size-fits-all model. Culturally responsive teaching can be interpreted in many different ways, but there are principles that you want to start to think about that can drive your context as you think about culturally responsive teaching. It's not just about strategies, but about who we are and how we approach our work. And also, but it's not always comfortable, but requires some kind of self-reflective stance. So these are all the ways of being that we need to actually think from a culturally responsive lens, not necessarily just do a strategy that's culturally responsive, but think about our work from those moves that I described earlier. How do we respond? How do we give feedback? How do we connect what we're teaching with the lives and the experiences of our students? And how are we fitting their needs in our work? So at Morgan State University, we've done several projects. We've had several grants where we've actually come up with our 5 principles of culturally responsive teaching. These are the ones that drive our work. It's not necessarily all the principles, but we did what we call a bottom-up approach to coming up with the kind of culturally responsive principles that we were going to adopt as a school and as a department. I was working with the math department and across different STEM departments, and these were the projects, the principles that we came away with. So one was about hands-on activities, which is the active learning principle, we call that. Incorporating more student-led discussions and teaching opportunities. So this idea of finding ways for students to lead discussions and to drive the work. Becoming conscious of biased judgments about students based on limited perceptions of them and being willing to change these perceptions. I put this one in yellow because this principle actually helped drive the rest of them. So there's the active learning, there's the student focused led instructions, but without us being conscious of our own bias, many of these things would have fallen flat. Having students apprenticeships that fosters empowered learning communities where we think of our instruction as a learning community, not as me, the faculty, doing all the work. So we really thought about ways to think about our students as an apprentice to our work, not just the people we're feeding into and giving all this information. And then principle 5 is what we call the curriculum principle, which is using students' lived experience as a context for course content and activities. So these were the 5 principles. We decided and chose these 5 to drive our instruction. And again, you could, depending on your context, you may choose other principles. There are a lot of different principles of culturally responsive teaching that are out there. I think at the workshop we were given, it was about 40. And we said, well, we're not going to try to do 40. We're going to pick ones that we think are relevant. And these were the 5 that we stuck to. And everything that we go back to goes back to these principles. Are you active? How are students leading the discussions? How are you doing reflective practices? How are you seeing students as apprentices and empowering your learning communities? And then how are you using students' lived experiences as a context for course activities? So these were our principles. And I know the elephant in the room is, how do I do this? How do I take those principles to real life, right? Everybody wants to know strategies. Lucky for you, I do have strategies. But before I talk about strategies, I want to just say this, and I'm going to end here. Who you are dictates what you do, which dictates the results you have. Okay, I'm going to say that again. The being, who you are. So who I am is a person who's shifting the narrative of Black children from a deficit narrative to an asset narrative. That's who I am. Everything I do is grounded in shifting that narrative. So it gives rise to the kind of strategies that I choose to adapt, which then gives rise to the results that I have. What I feel like people are trying to do with culturally responsive teaching is they're trying to do the strategies without the context or the positioning that will have the strategies live. If you're not questioning your intention, who you are, where you're coming from, as you adapt these strategies, what will happen is you will abandon them as soon as a challenge occurs. So part of the work we do with faculty is to help them become better instructors that really is from a culturally responsive lens. And so they do things differently. And so they get different results. Okay. And so the biggest thing you need to really embrace if you're going to be a culturally responsive instructor is being in the gap. So you got to go from what you're currently doing to some culturally responsive aligned practices and being willing to live in the gap and be okay that there's going to be a gap. All right, so here are some strategies. I want always in here, connecting classroom experiences to the lived realities of your students. Some of you may incorporate social justice-based learning, adopt a pedagogical approach that draws on various ways of knowing. There are many different ways to know and represent STEM learning, not just the test, not just in ways that we're used to. Please understand that different students know things in different ways. So is your pedagogical approaches allowing students to draw on their funds of knowing and knowledge to articulate their knowing? Develop structured study groups that empowered learners. Remember, we said this empowered learning community is very important. Students have to learn how to structure study groups that empower them. Engage in context-focused, not activities, it should be activities that allow students to unpack issues of race, class, sex, and ability and their relationship to STEM learning, and also challenge dominant narratives, encourage counter narratives. And I have several. When you get this, you can go through this. There are many strategies here. Interdisciplinary learning to me is very important for culturally responsive teaching, using problem-based approaches. Like I can go on and on with strategies. You can Google strategies. The thing that I want to leave you with is that strategies fall flat when you don't have a perspective and principles that ground your work. Even if it's only 2 principles, if you honor those principles and you engage in them in a way that matters, we can move equity and inclusion from the margins to the center of our work. So again, these will be shared with you. I say never sell out on the problem when it gets hard. We can't teach our STEM students to sell out if we're selling out, right? We tell our students when a problem gets hard, that's when it gets juicy. I would say the same is true for diversity. Nobody wants us to give up on this diversity and inclusion outcome just because it's hard and messy. Just like we don't want our STEM students to give up on our content when it's hard and messy, right? And be willing to interrogate your own conceptions of power, privilege, normality, and centrality. That's its own workshop by itself. Because in STEM, we have certain normative practices that really do foster power dynamics and privilege that keeps the status quo going. The reason we have not achieved diversity and equity in STEM is because there are certain practices that we hold dear that actually contradicts the diversity that we're trying to create. And that is it. Thank you. I tried to be as concise as I could. I want to thank each of you from the bottom of my heart for being here. And thank you, AAAS, for asking me to come and for accepting my proposal to talk. And I'm just so pleased, and I can't wait for the breakout rooms.
Dr. Ellington, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your experiences and also your insights on culturally responsive teaching. For the audience, I just want to remind you to make sure that you write down any questions as you're listening to the presentations today and save those for the breakout rooms so that we can kind of discuss them at length. I'd now like to hand things over to Dr. Singh.
All right, thank you. I'm gonna share my screen, so I hope you can see the screen. And it's a real honor to be here with you and to follow Dr. Ellington. You know, this is wonderful because everything she said, I totally agree with. And I hope that my talk builds on what she talked about. So, you know, I am going to show you this picture to begin with, which is a very famous picture from a physics conference, right, from 1927. And one of the things that you see in this picture is that there is absolutely no diversity here. For example, if you look at women here, there's only one woman, that is Marie Curie, and there is no racial or ethnic diversity. Everybody is white in this picture. So, and if you look at a picture of a recent conference like this one, which is also a physics conference, you see that things haven't changed very much. It kind of looks very similar to that. So, you know, I mean, we have come 100 years later, things are still the same. And, you know, so when you think about the history of physics, it's being told through the stories of brilliant men. And that kind of a mindset is propagating even now in our culture, not just in physics, in other disciplines as well, right? I mean, like in most of the STEM disciplines, the culture is very similar. So with that in mind, just think about this, like, how do you think a student who's sitting in the third row or fourth row or fifth row and looking at all the people in front who don't look like them, how will they feel about it? Can it increase students' anxiety about being in that class? How might they feel about their potential in that class? And what can you as an instructor do to empower all of your students and make sure that everybody has a sense of belonging? Everybody has an identity as a person who can excel in those STEM disciplines. Everybody has a high self-efficacy about being able to actually do the problems well in that discipline. Everybody has growth mindset about working hard, working smart, and growing their brain, because brain is a muscle. So you have to actually do something to empower your students, right? So that they recognize their struggle, embrace it, and use it as a learning opportunity. The question is, I want you to think about it. Just take 10 seconds to think about, what are you doing? Because one of the things that I wanted to say that is particularly detrimental to people who are stereotyped, like women and racial ethnic minority students in the STEM discipline, is this thing called stereotype threat, which is the fear of confirming a negative stereotype about one's group. So for example, if I go to an instructor and I say, oh, I've tried my homework problems and here is a problem that I'm having difficulty with, and the instructor tells me, oh, this problem is trivial, or this is obvious, or this is so easy. Now notice that the instructor may have said it with a good intention, but that to me means that I am not smart enough to actually do physics, because I have no role models. I don't see other people like me. And I am getting the message that I have worked hard on this thing. And now here I am asking instructor for help on this. And the instructor is saying this is trivial. And it is really important for the instructor to recognize that it's not their intentions that really matter. What is important is what impact it's having on the students. Like Dr. Ellington said, you have to keep the students at the center, and what the students' circumstances are and why they are feeling that way. So students are having this threat, like they are already questioning whether they belong there. And now you have told them something is trivial when they have worked hard with it. It's increasing their threat from orange to, dark red. And so this kind of awareness of stereotypes is taxing because it takes up your cognitive resources. Cognitive science says that your brain can only keep 5 to 9 things when you're thinking about something. For example, when you're solving problems. And now if some of your cognitive resources are being robbed by the anxiety that is ensuing from the stereotype threats, you have less cognitive resources to solve problems when you are learning and engaging with learning, and when you are taking tests and exams. And it can be demotivating to see something that you don't know, because people might say, oh, I am struggling with these problems because maybe people like me are not likely to be good at this. I don't see other people like me in this discipline. What's the point of even trying? So the point is that people can get into this negative feedback loop. And if we don't take responsibility as instructors to create an equitable and inclusive learning environment in which all students have a high sense of belonging, growth mindset, and an identity as a person who can excel in STEM, then we have actually failed and not done our responsibilities well. So I'll give you some other example. Like this is an example, again, that causes stereotype threat for students. Like this says, Professor Smith is concerned about high failure rate in his introductory course. And to encourage students to work harder, he starts the first class by telling students that this is a difficult course and usually about 25% of the students fail. They must be careful, particularly if they think that their background preparation is weak. You can see already Dr. Ellington did a brilliant job of actually talking about why this kind of a thing is bad, because she was saying that if you don't keep your things student-centric, here you can see that from the first day, you are displaying a fixed mindset as an instructor. You are showing that you are only teaching to the people who are actually on the top, when we should really be teaching to the top 100%, all of the students. And saying these kinds of things are actually making those students become even more anxious, have higher stereotype threats, who come from underprivileged background, who are coming from schools that have failing infrastructure, that didn't have good science classes or didn't have AP courses and things like that. So you are telling those students that they don't even belong in your class because 25% of them will fail. So they start thinking about the fact that they must be the people you're talking to, and what's the point of even trying? So these kinds of things are really actually creating a negative and toxic environment in our classes, whether we recognize it or not. And we need to recognize that it's what impact we are having that is important, not our intentions. So if you say ambiguous things, such as problems are trivial when the students have struggled and they have come to you, students are more likely to go into this reliance of stereotype, and they start questioning their own ability. And that can actually increase their anxiety and diminish their performance and lower their sense of belonging, self-efficacy, and their engagement with things. And that can actually create this negative loop that can further diminish performance. So we need to recognize what role we play in students' lives, and how certain things we are doing are really negatively impacting the students. So again, very similar to what Dr. Ellington's talked about, you need to really think about curriculum and instruction with focus on students. That's the most important thing, right? Who are our students, and how can I make sure that all of the students do well? And in that context, with students in mind, you need to think about selecting your curricula and pedagogies. And very importantly, how do you implement the curricula and pedagogy? Because notice that the same curricula and pedagogy will need to be adapted to different student groups if you really understand the students well and where they are coming from and what is their background. So that is really important to keep in mind. And equally importantly, one of the things that I would say, we have never thought about the fact that we should really be thinking about students holistically, and we should be strengthening both their defense and offense. What do I mean by that? If I were a tennis coach, I really want to make sure that my mentee, this person that I'm coaching, actually becomes good at both defense and offense, not just offense. Unfortunately, for too long in the STEM disciplines, we have only been focusing on thinking about our job as helping students develop good problem-solving skills, helping them transfer their learning from one situation to the other, helping them develop a robust understanding of the concepts that we are teaching. But we have completely forgotten the important role that we play in developing students' sense of belonging, their identity as a person who can excel in STEM, they're developing their growth mindset, the fact that intelligence is not immutable. It's not like on people who look like Einstein and Schrodinger can do physics, but everybody has the ability to do physics, and you should be working hard, working smart, taking advantage of challenges, and your brain is a muscle that can grow. And improving their self-efficacy, because notice that all of these things, if you actually create a learning environment which is equitable and inclusive, in which students have a high sense of belonging, high sense of identity as a STEM person, as a science person, growth mindset, and high self-efficacy, these things will also impact their interest positively. So interest itself is not a fixed thing. It can grow with you recognizing and affirming your students and validating them and helping them grow more. And it also will increase their achievement goals. And it will also have a positive impact on these kinds of things that you're teaching, problem solving and developing of good knowledge structure. Now, notice that if you don't focus on these kinds of things, the students who are most disadvantaged are those who are from underrepresented groups in those disciplines. Women, racial ethnic minority students, and other students like low-income students, first-generation students, those are the ones who are going to have low sense of belonging, low identity. So if we don't recognize our role, students actually will not be, who are not able to develop their defenses on their own, will actually also struggle with this aspect, and we would have failed as instructors, whether we recognize it or not. And too often, when people talk about evidence-based curricula and pedagogies, they never actually even look at how different demographic groups are doing. And if those things are not necessarily helping all students from all different demographic groups, they are not really evidence-based curricula and pedagogies. So making sure that we have a good combination of defense and offense, and we create a safe and inclusive learning environment in which students are not feeling judged, they want to work with other students, is really important. For example, we have done research studies in which we have shown that people who are saying they're using evidence-based curricula and pedagogies, in those courses, maybe students are learning more compared to the control group, but we are seeing, for example, that gender gap is increasing. That means that men are actually disproportionately being advantaged by being put in groups. That means somehow those group interactions are not really working from people who are underrepresented in those groups. And that is actually a sign of inequity. And saying that these things are evidence-based is actually wrong in those contexts. I also wanted to talk about self-efficacy because this is something that I have done a lot of studies on. This is one's belief in one's ability to succeed in a particular discipline, right? And it can impact students' persistence and engagement. And notice that it's not just your grade in a particular course that is important. It is also your defenses, your things like self-efficacy, things like your identity as a person who can excel in STEM, because low self-efficacy can actually drive you out of a major or career, regardless of your performance, because you may not think that you're as good as you really are. So I'm going to give you some examples in the context of physics. So let me show you the data. These are data from Introductory Physics 1 and 2. We're taken from a large number of students. On the horizontal axis, you see here grades, grade A, B, C. And this is self-efficacy at the end of Physics 1. And this is self-efficacy at the end of Physics 2. And what you see here is that in Physics 1, women with A grade have the same self-efficacy as men with B grade. And by the end of Physics 2, the same people, women with A grade now have self-efficacy close to men with C grade. So you can see that the difference between the self-efficacy about how good people are at problem solving in physics is going from bad to worse. Right? So physics learning environments are actually hurting women and making their self-efficacy worse. This is definitely a sign of non-inclusive and non-equitable learning environment. And you can see these are some quotes from women, and I don't want to go too much into it. You will have these slides. I wanted to talk about an intervention that we actually did. And this is a field tested intervention that has been done a lot at the K through 12 level. And we did it in college classrooms, college physics classrooms, and in biology classrooms. And I'll show you data from both of those and what impact it has on women and racial and ethnic minority students. So this is an intervention and the good thing about these interventions is that they are pretty short. Of course, they require what Dr. Ellington was already talking about, that you as an instructor who actually is doing this intervention actually has growth mindset. That means you feel that all of your students have the potential to excel in that discipline. Because if you don't have that growth mindset, this is not going to work, because you need that authentic connection, that trust between you and the students when you are actually delivering this message at the beginning of the course. So what is this intervention? It only takes 25 minutes. In our case, the first time around when we did it, we actually did it as a control study. Later on, after that, for the last 4 years, we have been doing it in all of our introductory calculus-based physics courses. So let me tell you about the control study that we did several years ago. So this is a 25-minute activity that was done in recitation classes in large introductory physics courses. By recitation, I mean, if the class is of several hundred students, the students are broken up into these smaller groups where they do problem solving in small groups. And notice that in group situation, you can really actually exploit the benefits of diversity. But if the learning environment is not equitable and inclusive, then you will not recognize the benefit of diversity, because the stereotype group is not going to really feel comfortable. They will not feel safe in participating in the conversation, and the majority group will take over, and they are the only ones who are going to do all the work. And they will not let the other people actually be part of the community where actually it is likely to enhance everybody's outcome. So the goal of this thing is, this is why we call it an ecological belonging and mindset intervention. The goal of this activity is to change this intersubjective space and create a better culture in the classroom. And it only takes 25 minutes. So in our case, 3 instructors teaching very large classes with more than 200 students participated, and their recitations were randomly either assigned to this intervention or not. So basically 6 recitations participated in this particular activity, and the rest of them were normal recitations in which students were just doing problem solving in small groups all through the recitations. And the message that we are trying to give is that struggling is the only way to learn something new. So you should be proud of struggling, since that means that you're already on your way to learn something new. And so you should be doing challenging problems and pat yourself on the back every time you're struggling. Because even Einstein said, if you haven't struggled, you haven't tried to learn anything new. And the person who's actually facilitating this actually talks about their own adversity and their own challenges when they were in similar classes, and how they actually took advantage of the adversity, use that as a stepping stone to getting ahead and doing challenging problems. So they actually, are here just because they actually didn't get phased out by the adversity, but took it as a challenge that they should learn from and get ahead. So the point is that the idea of this, again, as I said, is to reduce anxiety, reduce procrastination, increase enthusiasm for solving challenging problems, and ensure that students' limited cognitive resources are being used not by the anxiety, but for actually solving the problem. So they're not being robbed. So in the intervention group then, basically in the first time when we did it as an intervention, 2 physics female graduate students actually worked with the TA to give this message. So they went to the recitation in the first recitation class and they said, "Hi, we are from the physics department, and physics department really wants to understand your concerns." So it can really feel, it can be easy to feel overwhelmed and ask yourself, do I really belong here? Am I smart enough to be in this course? These kinds of experiences are normal. So almost everybody goes through it. So why don't you write about your concerns about being in the college or being in this physics course? And how do you think these things will change over time? Notice that these students are also first-year students because they are actually science and engineering majors, all of whom have to take the first physics course. What do you think students wrote about? They wrote a lot. In 10 minutes, they had to actually be told to stop writing. And here is one of the things, and this is not even cherry picked. It says, "I'm extremely worried that I have calculated my mental abilities by end up in engineering." By the way, a lot of these students are engineers because they have to take physics. But, women especially were writing things that were very clearly things that were higher anxiety things than what men were writing. So I don't want to actually get into exact quotes from people. We have even done a lot of interviews with women and men, especially with women, because we really want to understand their stories. And after students write this, then we actually show them what students from prior years who have actually had these had the same course and who have really been successful, what do they have to say about what they were feeling, right? So basically it starts by saying students' path to success is a journey which has a beginning, middle, and end. And along that path, some struggles will be encountered, but they will be overcome with effort. And you should be using your struggle as a learning opportunity. So basically talking about the fact that adversity is common and it is temporary. If you work hard, work smart, it'll go away. So here is one of the examples. And notice that some of the names here would be those of women or men, or some of those you can tell that these are not white students. And we want all of them to say the same story in their own words. And by the way, these are real quotes from real students that have been curated a little. And they're all saying things like, "When I went there, I was really worried. And then I realized that the thing was to work hard and work smart and take advantage of the resources, work with my peers, be proud of struggling, pat myself on my back, go to my instructor and TA's office hours and keep working and doing challenging problems. And lo and behold, I ended up getting an A grade. I did really well, right?" And after this, students are asked to get together in groups of 5 and talk about what they wrote. And also, why don't students realize that struggling with these kinds of things is so common and that it is a good thing, something that should be embraced. And when you put it that way, what students realized in these small groups is that every student was pretty much saying the same thing. At University of Pittsburgh, more than 90% of the students were all writing that they are really concerned and they were worried about how they are going to do, regardless of their gender, race, etc. And that's a good thing for other people to know who are from underrepresented group, because they think that there is some kind of a thing about them that makes them actually struggle. That's not really true. So this getting rid of this pluralistic ignorance is a good thing, but also talking about the fact that adversity is the stepping stone to getting somewhere, and you should be learning from those adversities and getting ahead slowly is something that we were emphasizing in this message. And after each student groups actually discuss things, we have a general class discussion. This is it, 25 minutes. So by the way, at the end of this, sometimes students even clapped. And some of the women and racial ethnic minority students even came and said, thank you so much for doing this, because we are feeling so much better. We were so anxious about being here. And at this point, you know, if we had not gotten any other results, but just that would have been good in itself. But I'm going to actually at this point show you what we found in terms of students' grades. And here I'm talking about men and women. And you can see that the control group is showing the blue is men and the brown is women. You can see that there is a difference in the performance on the final exam between men and women, whereas the gap actually went away in the social belonging group. And here, this is more detailed data that also breaks it down based upon the student's race. And what you can see, again, is the same kind of thing is true here as well. If you look at the red is the intervention group, the blue is the control group. And again, this you can see that both on non-white students and women, it had a very positive effect in the physics course. And these are results by gender in biology courses. And again, you can see that it has a positive, very, very positive effect on non-white students in the biology class as well. So a short intervention that actually depends, can only be implemented well with instructor having growth mindset and doing these kinds of activities can go a long way in even bridging the performance gap. And by the way, this thing has now been replicated at University of Cincinnati, Minnesota, and Princeton University, and Ohio State University, and people are showing positive benefits of this activity. I also wanted to say that now that we are doing it in all of our classes and not as an intervention, one of the other things that I wanted to point out is that same kind of interventions can be very useful for thinking about inclusive mentoring when you are actually supporting your students in individual research, whether they're undergraduate or graduate students, because even there, people who are underrepresented in those disciplines who don't have role models are more likely to question whether they have what it takes to succeed and whether they are on the right path. And I will give you an example, for example, of this woman who wrote a book in 2016 called The Only Woman in the Room. She actually was the first woman to get her bachelor's degree at Yale University in physics. And she basically quit and then did her graduate work in English because she said that she didn't feel like she belonged there. And she was doing just fine. She did really well in college. And she even did the mandatory project that she was supposed to do for her thesis, undergraduate thesis on theoretical work. And when she solved that problem, she ran to her advisor's office because she thought that he would actually be so happy. He'll say, Eileen, you've done such an awesome job. You should be going to grad school. And when she knocked on his door, he said, okay. And she said, I went from being triumphant to feeling like I was at the bottom of the ocean because that meant that maybe this problem was like really not something that, meant anything. It was some trivial problem. And so she just quit physics and went into English because there people were recognizing her, praising her and affirming her, and physics, nothing. The interesting thing was when she went back in 2016 and she actually met the same person who was now the undergraduate advisor in the department about what he thought about her thesis. He said, oh, Eileen, I still remember it. Not that many people do theoretical work. Yours was exceptional. And she said, really? Why didn't you tell me? I would still have been a physicist, because physics was my first love. Do you ever praise anybody? Do you ever tell people to go to grad school? And he said, no, grad school is so hard. I don't want to give people the wrong impression. The point is that by not validating, by not affirming students, the students you're losing out on are the students who actually are from underrepresented group because they don't know whether they are making good progress. They don't know whether they have what it takes. They don't have role models. They don't have anything. They don't know that research is not supposed to move in a straight path. They don't know that they're doing a good job. So it's really important for us to affirm students, validate students, even in, research situation, not to mention in classroom situation, we should also be thinking of ourselves as mentors and making sure that all of our students excel. So at this point, I think that I would like to stop and take any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Dr. Singh. We really appreciate your presentation, and I'd like to express our gratitude to both speakers for joining us today and lending their insights on promoting equity in undergraduate STEM classrooms. I think that we will actually be shifting over to our breakout rooms now, so we can start taking questions there. Before we do so, I'd like to thank everyone who joined us via the YouTube live stream. As I mentioned before, we are transitioning to those breakout rooms, so the live stream will end. I want to thank you all for joining us in the main session again. I hope you enjoyed your breakout room discussions. I'd like to ask each of our speakers and facilitators to take a quick minute to share key takeaways from their discussion. Dr. Ellington, why don't we start with you?
It was a rich discussion. I think the essence of our discussion was who do we need to be, right? That was something that struck people, and really getting at how do you build relationships, and what's your kind of fundamental approaches to building a culture of culture responsiveness. And the big takeaway was, one, shifting your identity from someone who's a content expert for someone who's a teacher and a person who's teaching a student, right? So putting students at the center, and then really asking them, what are they up to? Why are they there? And then at times where you can, integrating the content that you're teaching with some of the things that the students are having, actually create that partnership with them and really ask them. I say rate my professor as a way to start dialogue, because they out here rating y'all, by the way. They got a story about you. So you might want to figure out what that story is and use it as a way to build a certain learning community that is responsive and culturally sensitive. And that's kind of the big takeaway. Like, how do you become the kind of instructor that can really use these strategies and not feel intimidated when they go left, right? So, and I love what my other colleague talked about, this going from offense and defense. You got to teach yourself offense and defense, right? Sometimes what we want to defend actually could be used in an offensive way. Like, oh, I can use this as a way to strike up dialogue. I don't have to defend against anything. I can use it to serve me and what I'm up to. But that requires you to know who you are and what you're up to and what game you're playing as an instructor. So that was the big takeaway. If I captured it well enough, that's the takeaway.
Those are some great takeaways. It sounds like it was a very productive session. Let's turn it over to Dr. Singh now to hear about takeaways from her discussion.
So we had a great discussion too, and we focused a lot on how this intervention that I was talking about can be adapted to different kinds of classes, and also what were the long-term effects of this intervention, and also what is the, how important is the instructor's mindset, and what would be the impact, how we can actually make sure that students really benefit from this intervention. So those were the major things that we discussed.
That sounds like some great takeaways. A lot to cover there in a short amount of time. I'd like to switch the discussion over to the facilitators now. Dr. Arnold, why don't we start with you? What did your group talk about?
We basically talked about the experiences of the undergraduate STEM educator. And there was definitely a lot of takeaways, but one of the main takeaways was how to break the ice with, getting your students to be responsive, especially if you're looking at different demographics within your group that you're teaching. And so one of the things that we felt was necessary was your narrative, the instructor's narrative. Sharing the story of you kind of makes you human, and it shows a vulnerable side of you so that your students are not so uptight when it comes to the student-teacher relationship. So opening that up is imperative. Patrick had brought up active learning and starting small conversations within smaller groups to gauge where the students are prior to learning all the content. Justina had a really great point, and she shared one of her stories that one of the students shared with her that this was the first time that the professor saw me before the course. And I thought that was an excellent indicator of building that relationship with your students, no matter what demographic they come from.
That's great to hear. Yeah, the icebreakers and the inroads for how you start discussions are so important. All right, let's switch over to Dr. Marshman now. What were the takeaways from your session?
I think three main points we kind of touched on in terms of how to adapt the intervention that Dr. Singh talked about during her presentation, and the ethics of actually having a control group. Since the intervention did so well in improving learning outcomes for the students in the intervention group, we were kind of thinking of ways to like help all students. So we really, you have to tailor these interventions for your specific student body. So you do have to start taking survey and doing interviews with students to see the kinds of things that they are concerned about and the struggles that they may be facing, and possibly doing an intervention that's not exactly the same, but it's still something that could benefit the students, like a study skills session or something like that. But you've got to start somewhere. The second point that we focused on was the instructor's mindset. So that we are all humans. We are not superhuman beings, one of the participants mentioned, and that when we fail or make errors, that's an opportunity for learning. And we as instructors, we have struggles ourselves. We didn't just sail through undergrad and grad school with no obstacles at all. So sharing those stories with our students is extremely helpful. And also sharing our students sharing our stories with the students that we are mentoring, especially if those are students from diverse demographic groups, to say, hey, we're human. We face struggles going through undergrad and grad school. We face setbacks, and just realizing that our students are humans and getting to know our students. If they're having a problem, they should be able to feel comfortable to at least tell us and let us know that they're not going to be in class that day or something like that. So, which is very much the opposite of what we do as scientists. We kind of take a lot of the human element out when we're writing papers and things. So just kind of focusing on the instructor's mindset when they're teaching and mentoring students, and remembering to share our stories with our students. And that allows them to share their stories too.
Mm-hmm. Those are some great takeaways. Yeah, not every class is the same. And yeah, you certainly want an opportunity to share your own stories there to open up that dialogue. Great. And now let's hear from Dr. Doucette. How was your conversation?
Yeah, we had a really great conversation. Two main things came up. The first of all was sort of in this age of academic austerity and physics courses, for example, being cut from high schools and departments from universities, that the pipeline, as it were, is getting smaller. And Kara made this great point that that means that the students that are in our classes are going to be even more precious than ever. And we need to make sure that we're doing everything that we can to avoid establishing barriers and avoid sending students away for reasons that are under control. And then we spent most of our time just talking about things that I think of as sort of related to the culturally responsive teaching that we started off with today. Some of the things like making connections with other disciplines, or making connections to applications or to the job market, and also attending to students' identities and positionalities when we're going through this work as being something that is a valuable sort of instructional and pedagogical approach.
Yes, that's great. All valuable elements. Sounds like a very productive discussion. So great. Before we go, I do want to thank all of our speakers and facilitators, our AAAS-IUSE team, and all of you who joined and participated in today's workshop. We have a post-event survey link, which we are dropping in the chat. We'll also send around via email. It only takes a minute, and we really, really appreciate all of your feedback. Additionally, a recording of the presentation and a copy of the slides will be coming around via email. It'll also be available on our website in the coming week. And once again, I just want to thank everyone and thank you all for joining us today. We look forward to engaging with you and learning from you, the AAAS-IUSE community. So thanks, everyone.